he was elected the editor-in-chief of the Marquette Law Review. He is a former judicial law clerk for the Honorable Anne Walsh Bradley of the Wisconsin Supreme Court and practiced law for 15 years at 2 National Law Journal 250 firms. So with that, we are very happy to welcome back to the chapel stage at Christ Memorial Church, President Kurt Dykstra.
There we go. All right, perfect. The joy of being this far away is I can take the mask off. The difficulty with being this far away is that I'm this far away. I remember when Jay Leno took over The Tonight Show from Johnny Carson, he and, of course, Dave Letterman sort of started their own shows at the same time. And one of the things that Letterman's show took off first, and Leno really struggled for the first year, and part of the reason is that Carson had the studio set up where he was probably double the space from the audience from his monologue spot, and Leno kept that at first, and it just didn't work for him. I'm feeling like Carson, but want to be more like Leno. But in this particular moment, we're stuck with what we've got. Well, it is a delight to be with you, delight to be back at CMC. So many good memories of being here. Our daughters dancing and singing and doing all sorts of things at Christmas. I mean, Christmas meant being here at CMC all day long. Leah's involvement with the GEMS program on Wednesday nights. I was in city council sorts of things, so I wasn't around quite as much on Wednesday nights, but so many good people, such good missions, such a good ministry, so many incredible things that you've all been a part of for so long, and it's a real treat to be able to be back with you today. I do bring you greetings from the campus of Trinity. We are delighted to welcome your students and faculty and staff and members as members of our staff. We're a school that is younger than most. We are 61 years old. This fall, I like to say that when the oldest school in the country, Harvard, was 61 years old, it was 100 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So that gives you a bit of a sense as to the span of age of institutions. But we're a school that has punched pretty high above our weight class from day one, and we continue to do that. In fact, just this last week, I was at a funeral of our faculty member who taught the first class at the college. So we have that kind of connection to our founding. So the college opened up with a convocation, and then third-hour class kicked in, Latin taught by Dr. Dirk Bergsma, and Dr. Bergsma passed away at 93 last week. And so it's a gift to have that kind of ability to connect with and be a part of a place where so many remember the earliest days of a place. But we continue to do good work, and we'll talk a bit about that as well. So, what should we talk about? What is going on in the world? There's so much we could talk about. I thought maybe what I would do is talk about what kind of future is being set up for us all right now. And I thought I might do that through... Is my clicker working here? All right. Uh-oh, we got troubles. Well, let's see here. Looks like the battery is good. I wonder if there's somehow kind of tell you what, if you just want to, maybe I'll just would you advance the slide, please? We'll just hit the space bar and we'll call it good. All right, there we go. I'd like to sort of think about this through 3 stories that make one argument applied in one context. All right, so does that capture your attention a little bit, maybe? Well, if it doesn't, too bad, because that's the direction we're going. All right, if you hit the space bar, please. So first, the first story. We can hit the space bar one more time, please. So the first story involves Congress. How about that for a way to kick things off on a Sunday morning, right? Let's talk about Congress. No, not the current Congress, but this is a picture of the Capitol building in 1861. The 37th Congress was sworn in March of 1861, and we can advance the slide. At the same time, of course, this particular person was also sworn in as president in March of 1861. Abraham Lincoln was sworn in, and that Congress, which went from March of 1861 to March of 1863, saw some pretty remarkable experiences over that 2-year window. For example, the firing upon Fort Sumter. Then things like the First Battle of Bull Run, which everybody quite honestly thought that the Civil War would be a very short and minimal kind of experience. So there were people who tried to get in fast because they didn't want to miss it. And the social atmosphere in Washington was such that people would come in their carriages out to the battlefield because they wanted to watch it. It was almost like watching a sporting event. Well, the battle started out just fine for the Union, but then turned in a pretty ugly way, and it turned into a pretty big rout, and there was a traffic jam, essentially. All the people trying to flee from the battlefield to get back to Washington intermixed with retreating and disoriented Union soldiers. So the First Battle of Bull Run. Next slide, please. Then there was, go back one, if you would. There we go. The Battle of Antietam happens in 1862, September of 1862. And this image is a painting, of course, of the Battle of Antietam. But what Antietam also introduced into the consciousness of American was, the next slide, please, was actual photographs for the first time from the battlefield. And the American public got to see what the battlefield actually looked like. And maybe we're a little bit numb to this, even though this causes us, of course, to take a breath as well. But imagine seeing these kinds of images for the very first time. Well, the Union wins the Battle of Antietam, and thereafter, a few days later, Abraham Lincoln, next slide please, issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which was set to take effect at the start of 1863. So all of these things are happening in this 37th Congress, right? And these are things that we probably know something about. We've heard of Bull Run, we've heard of Antietam, we've heard of the Emancipation Proclamation. But the 37th Congress also did some incredible things that had long-term impact on the country. The Morrill Act, the Homestead Act, the Transcontinental Railroad were all authorized by the Congress of 1837. So if we go forward, there was a wonderful book written in 1987. Next slide, please. Sorry, one more. There we go. A wonderful book written by James McPherson, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1987, called Battle Cry of Freedom. And McPherson says that this 37th Congress is a pivot point between the United States that was and the United States that we now know. So, by its legislation to finance the war, emancipate the slaves, invest in public land and future growth, and the Transcontinental Railroad, the 37th Congress did more than any other Congress in history to change the course of national life, drafting the blueprint for modern America that some historians have labeled as the Second American Revolution. One more slide, please. McPherson goes on to say, this new America of big business, heavy industry, and capital-intensive agriculture that surpassed Britain to become the foremost industrial nation by as recent as 1880, after all this is taking place, and become the world's breadbasket for much of the 20th century, probably would have come about even if the Civil War had not happened. But the war molded the particular configuration of this new society, and the legislation of the 37th Congress did indeed help fashion a future different enough from the past to merit the term of revolution. That's story one. Next slide, please. Let's go to story two. Story two involves, next slide, please, this man, probably less familiar by image, a man named Edward Elgar. Elgar was born in Great Britain in the latter part of the 19th century, lived until 1934. Elgar was a British composer. Unique in some ways that Elgar was self-taught. Elgar did not study formally with anyone of any significance. Basically learned both the organ, the piano, and I think the violin, and his composition methods by reading books and studying as much as he possibly could. Elgar, who, you can go to the next slide, please, at his death was highly regarded. And in fact, in the early part of the 19th century, 1904, Elgar writes a couple of items and out of obscurity becomes this noted composer. In fact, what happens is for 3 whole days at Covent Gardens in the West End of London at the Royal Opera House, there is basically an Elgar festival, something that had never happened in the history of Great Britain before, where it was 3 days solid of Elgar's music. The King and the Queen show up at least twice to experience this, and the London Times is just astounded by the fact that this is happening, and frankly, that this is happening for someone named Elgar. Next slide, please. We know Elgar, if to the extent we know him at all these days, because of basically two pieces of music that he wrote. The first is Pomp and Circumstance, which if you're British, next slide, you know as being one of the great themes of the proms that happen at St. Royal Albert's Hall in London. And if you're American, you know Pomp and Circumstance, of course, next slide please, as being part of the tradition of a commencement ceremony. So that's one reason we know Elgar today. The second reason, however, the second piece of music that he wrote, next slide please, is his variations on Enigma. Now, all of that is fine and interesting, and frankly, shortly after Elgar's death, he falls into obscurity until the 1960s when his music sees a resurgence and he is sort of reemerges as a composer of note. Gustav Holst had remained very popular. Benjamin Britten during that period had remained popular. Elgar had kind of waned in his popularity, but then in the 60s saw an uptick. But that's not why I bring up this story. One more slide, please. I bring up this story because Elgar is located at the intersection of composition, but also of technology. Elgar is the first composer, and you can click the slide one more time if you would. Elgar is one of the first composers to really embrace the gramophone. And so for most of his music, he actually has recordings of it with him conducting. Something remarkably, remarkably different from other composers of the era. So this is Elgar conducting Nimrod from the Enigma. Now, this might sound somewhat familiar as a tune, but listen for just a couple of seconds to this recording back from the early part of the 20th century. Back to that in a second. You can click the next slide, please. All right, so that's the second story. Here's the third story. One more slide. And this is a story that has a bit of a personal touch to it for Leah and for me. So 2 summers ago, we had the opportunity to spend some time in London. I'm also a student at the London School of Economics. So we were in London for a bit of a vacation, bit of a conference that I was speaking at, and then also to sort of take care of the final paperwork with some LSE stuff. And we decided to go visit Westminster Abbey, right? And we wanted to take in a concert at Westminster Abbey or a service at Westminster Abbey. Next slide, please. So we followed the rules and entered in through the nave after waiting in line for about 45 minutes. And then they take you around the side, past the choir, and then ultimately you sit kind of in that choir area. Now, a diagram is nice. Let me show you a photo. Next slide, please. This is not us, and it's not when we were there, but to give you a sense as to where we were seated, you see where the arrow is pointed? That's where we were sitting, right? Next slide, please. And if we look to our left to look at the choir leading the service, that's a painting, essentially, of what we were looking at. That was our view from our seat. That's to the left. To the right during this service, one more click, there was this thing sitting there. Now, they're very strict in Westminster Abbey about taking photographs. So this is a pirated photo that I took on the sly at the end of the service. And I figured if you know anything about the way the Church of England began, compared to that, snapping a photo or two in the Westminster Abbey is probably no big deal. Anyway, I noticed something immediately, and Leah noticed it too, but we didn't really talk about it with one another until after the service. And here's what we noticed. Next slide, please. Inscribed at the base of this pulpit podium is this: attempt great things for God. I figured that wasn't just a random inscription, so I did a little bit of research after the fact. Next slide, please. And it comes back to a gentleman named William Carey. And William Carey was born in Great Britain in the mid-18th century at a time when the Church of England was very stoic and very, as if they're not now, but at a time in which their attitude was, if God wants to save somebody, God will go ahead and do it, thank you very much. Our job is to maintain a stiff upper lip. Carey said, on the other hand, we need to be about evangelism, we need to be about missionary work, and single-handedly, William Carey becomes the person who reimagines what Great Britain looks like and what British missions look like. He travels to India as a missionary, starts a university in India, and really revitalizes the entire experience of Great Britain and the Church of England being a missionary-driven denomination, at least for a period of time. So that's the third story. Next slide, please. All right, those are the 3 stories. 37th Congress, Edward Elgar, William Carey. Here's my argument. Next slide, please. What in the world is our future going to hold? Now, that's a picture of Lake Michigan from, I'm guessing, about 2009. It was a staycation time for our family, and we had a boat-ish. It was a boat that was in the shop as much as it was in the water, but it was a boat, right? And we stayed home, and it was a gorgeous, gorgeous August time in West Michigan, and the waves were non-existent, and the water was warm. So we, next slide, please, took the girls out on the boat. So there they are, tubing, having a grand old time. And that is how I think the image of water that we all like to have, these kinds of experiences, fun, calm, beauty. What you can't see in this image is a few hours after this video and that photo was taken, we saw the most incredible sunset from 500 yards off the shore. It was an incredibly beautiful and wonderful day. That's what we like to think about, sort of maybe what the future looks like, that kind of image. Beautiful, calm, fun, meaningful. In reality, though, many times, and we're in one of those times right now, next slide, please, this is more what water looks and feels like, is it not? Now, I can tell you first, this is an image I grabbed off the internet. That's not a firsthand experience, thank you very much. That's the moment that we are in. That's the moment that we are in. So the argument I want to make, in the context I want to make it, is directly related to higher education, but you could pretty easily substitute out church communities. You could pretty easily substitute out other nonprofit agencies. You could talk about institutions generally. Next slide, please. So let me just give you a few of the grueling and grisly stats regarding higher ed. This is an image, a graph, of where higher ed has been in terms of cost, dating from 1969. So the ratio of average tuition and requires fees for all four-year degree-granting institutions to median household income. So it's pegged to median household income. In the late 60s, it was about 8.6% of median household income. This one stops in 2012 at 26.7, and you just know full well that if the graph continued, it would be higher than 26.7. That's graph one. Next slide, please. How about the way things have increased or decreased over time? TVs plummeted since 1996. Cell phone service has plummeted. Even new cars have plummeted. What's gone up? Healthcare has gone up. No surprise there. Childcare has gone up. No surprise there. But the top two, the highest rate of rise have been college tuition and college textbooks. That's part of the story that we're involved in higher ed right now in these choppy seas. Next slide, please. Then there is this wonderful book that was published a couple of years ago by a professor at Carleton College in Minnesota with a very interesting title. And I mean, just the movie is coming out soon. It's called Demographics and the Demand for Higher Education. It's actually not coming out very soon because it's dry but frightening. Here's what this book demonstrates, is that in the coming decade, the percentage of change of high school graduates in the upper Midwest is remarkable. So for every of those orange states, high school graduate numbers will decrease by greater than 15% over the coming decade. 7 to 15% decline is in yellow, and then the ones that are going to basically stay flat are unshaded. So if you note, there is a lot of orange on that particular graph, and a lot of states that look pretty familiar to a lot of us. And so we are faced with all of that. All of that waviness, all of those churny seas were present last year. All of those churny seas were present in January of 2020. And now, we have added into it at least one more pandemic, if not a second one. Next slide, please. So, one more slide. How do my three stories make my argument? So, there are moments in history that have oversized impact on what the future looks and feels like. Just like the 37th Congress in 1861 had a remarkable impact on the future trajectory of America, I am firmly in belief that the experience that we have had over the last year will have a massive, massive change for the future of, and again, in my context, higher education. Okay? I don't think that we will ever go back to whatever was normal before. That's just not going to happen. Normal is gone. Normal is finished. Normal is pre-1861 America. And what has been, we will not be going back to that. Next slide, please. What does the Elgar story have to do with this? Well, in part, what has changed in this last year has been, what do we do with technology? Elgar took things that had been happening for centuries, the composition and live playing of music, took that and adapted it to a technological age, the technology of the time, and recorded and produced recordings of his own compositions. Well, we in higher ed and other spaces as well are also going to be looking at what in the world is going on in our world, and how do we look at technology differently? How do we harness technology to do what we've done in a slightly different way? Now, I asked you to listen to that recording a few minutes ago, and maybe you noticed a couple of things. If you're familiar with that piece of music, you might have noticed two things. One is, it's fast. It's played very fast compared to how we normally hear that song played. Go to YouTube this afternoon and type in Nimrod Elgar, and you will hear lots of beautiful and moving renditions of that piece, but much, much slower and more drawn out than what Elgar himself did. The second thing you will notice when you listen to other recordings is, did you notice how the violins kind of slid from low to high, or slid from high to low in the note? It wasn't a clean break from note to note. It was more of a slide. We don't play it like that anymore. So my point in having you listen to that in particular was not just for the historical interestingness of it, but also to have you know that just because the technology is available doesn't mean that things remain as they are. We play Elgar differently today, even though we have heard how he played it back in his day, the man who wrote the music. And I am convinced that higher education in particular will harness technology in ways, but not completely sell out to it. Let's go to the third piece for a second, and then I'll wrap these three things together. And what do we do with this William Carey story? Well, next slide, please. The William Carey story, especially for places like Trinity, are so incredibly meaningful because they show and they remind us that we're not about this work alone and in solitary movement. In fact, we're part of a larger, grander story that's been going on for a long time. And if you look at what higher ed looks like today versus 100 years ago, versus 400 years ago, versus 1,000 years ago, there's been dramatic change that's happened, even in the last 20 to 50 to 100 years, substantial change that's happened. And at the same time, schools like ours that hold firm and believe deeply that God is in this work have a certain level of boldness about what we do. We haven't yet labeled our pulpits on campus with "attempt great things for God," but I'm not convinced we shouldn't, because ultimately I think that is and has to be our motto going forward. Next slide, please. So let me show you some differences and how, for example, the world has changed and how we have to adapt to it. This is maybe an example of these three things coming together. So, an organization called Ruffalo Noel Levitz, a firm you can hire, surveyed current Christian college students back in 2000. And these were students who had picked a Christian college and were then current students at a Christian college. And they said to them, these students, "Why did you pick the school you picked?" And these are the top 5 answers that these students at that time in 2000 gave. Integration of Christian faith and learning, the Christian atmosphere, the value of the education, ROI, we were talking those terms even back in 2000, fellowship with other Christians, essentially the faith aspect of the campus, and Christian faculty. Do you notice a theme, right, in 2000? And this probably shouldn't surprise us, because after all, these are Christian students picking a Christian college to attend for their 4-year experience. Well, Ruffalo and Noel Levitz asked the very same questions or similar questions 10 years later to current Christian college students 10 years later. Next slide, please. Here were the top 5 answers in 2009 as opposed to 2000. Preparation for future careers, quality of academic program, faculty who are well qualified, faculty who are excellent teachers, availability of financial aid and scholarships. Do you notice a change? Do you notice what's missing in the 2009 survey response versus the 2000 response? Well, I don't know that RNL has updated this survey since then, but I can tell you, being in the trenches on this work, the 2000 stuff would not be top 5 for most of our students. Now, does that mean they don't care about the 2000? Absolutely not, but they expect that. They expect that as part of the experience, and they are also highly concerned about the other stuff as well. They are highly concerned about, can I get employed once I graduate? As someone whose daughter just graduated and is now on her second job by choice since COVID, I can tell you this is a wonderful thing. They are concerned about the cost of education. Yes, they're deeply concerned about faith formation and commitment, but they're unwilling to sacrifice cost and outcome to have that kind of experience. Well, does that mean that we, for instance, as an institution, thinking about 1861, thinking about Elgar, thinking about William Carey, does that mean that we look at this sort of information and toss out what we were doing in 2000 to focus only on what happens in 2009? Do we toss out the stuff that was happening so that we can record, as Elgar did? Absolutely not. But it means that we have to adapt. We have to modify. We have to think a little differently about how we do what we do, always keeping at the core that central mission. As I mentioned earlier, we're a young school, 60 years, 61. And, in some ways, it's one of the great blessings of it, of course, is that you get to rub shoulders with people who've basically been around for most of the college's history. I mean, we had one of our faculty members who, for the college's 6 decades, was a part of it for 5, student, then faculty for 40 years. That's a real gift. The downside is that sometimes we don't think about history nearly as strongly. So I can tell you that we're a very different place today in 2020 than what we were 20 years ago. We're a very different place today in 2020 than what we were in 1980 in a lot of different ways because the world around us has changed. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower as president versus Donald Trump as president, I mean, these are 2 very different kinds of persons in very different kinds of eras. And for us as an institution, how do we basically take, adapt, and modify that core conviction, that core mission, and make it relevant in a contemporary context? That's what Elgar was doing when he recorded. That's what we're about today. One more slide. So I showed you I'm sorry, go ahead, one more. There we go. I showed you this image. There's another image of water that I want to leave you with today before we talk questions about this or, frankly, anything else you'd like to talk about. And go one more slide, if you will. It's that picture, another stormy sea picture. It is one of the Dutch masters, of course, a picture of the painting of the Sea of Galilee, calming the storm at Galilee. And we know the story behind the painting. We know the story behind the story, if you will. And we know that, of course, Jesus and the disciples are out on the boat, and the water is rough, and they wake Jesus up, and he says, "Peace be still," and calms the sea. So we in these roles, yes, we work hard at what we do. We try to maintain and do maintain core commitments to mission and conviction to mission, while at the same time adapting it in a contemporary context. But we also know, like William Carey knew, that we're not alone in this work. That we serve the one who says, "Peace be still." We serve the one who says, "Lazarus, come out." We serve the one who he himself died and rose again. And we're in this work not by ourselves, but with someone immensely and immeasurably powerful at our side and guiding our steps. These are really challenging times in so many institutions, church life, nonprofit spaces, business life, home life, college life, to be sure. And we recognize on the one hand that we need to be smart about what we do and think about how is the world changing and how do we adapt and modify and continue to be missionally minded in those adaptations. But at the same time, we also know that at the end of the day, God is going to do what God is going to do, despite or alongside of our feeble attempts to influence that work as well. So I think, let me just close with these couple of thoughts. One is, how do we deal with this? How do we as people in a congregation, as members of a community, how do we think about this? What can we do? A couple of practical things. First, we pray an awful lot. Right? I mean, this is what we do, right? This is the kind of people we are. We pray an awful lot. And I start there because obviously that's the most important and powerful piece. The second thing we do, though, is we encourage and care about these kinds of places. I am convinced that if these institutions go away, colleges, churches, other organizations, most likely they're not coming back. And I probably thought more about it in terms of colleges than anything else. If a college goes away, it's not coming back. All of us have drawn from wells we didn't dig. Right? We're sitting in this space, and I fully believe and frankly know that some in this room were instrumental in helping to construct this space. But all of us have come into this congregation, most all of us at least, when it's been an existing thing. And there were those who started this place, and there were those who caught the vision for having a place called Christ Memorial. And so we get the opportunity to draw from wells that we didn't dig. What are we going to leave? What are we leaving, not just for our kids? Because, I'm one of the younger people in the room here, and my two daughters are adults already. And yes, I care deeply about what the world looks like for them, but I think more about what are my grandkids going to inherit? People whom I will never, ever in my life meet. What kind of world are we leaving for them? What kinds of places are we leaving for them? Do we want them to have experiences like we've been the beneficiaries of? And what are we willing to do to do our best to see that those things happen? Those are the kind of questions that consume my daily quiet moments when I have the opportunity to not answer telephone calls or return emails. Constantly think about what kind of world are we leaving for our grandkids, and I invite you to think through those kinds of questions with us and to pray about it deeply and to continue to encourage and support the places that you care deeply about. And if you'd like to learn more about Trinity Christian College, hey, I'll happily tell you more about that too. But I know it's not just us, but it's much broader than us as well. So we're in really, really strange times, my friends, really strange times. Impactful times, 1861 kinds of times, combined with Elgarian sorts of moments, but always remembering that William Carey's great motto of attempt great things for God continues to be live and large with all of us. Thanks for listening and being here for a bit of this time today, and I'd happily take questions about anything I've talked about or other stuff that you find interesting and want to ask me questions about. Yes?
If you spend time with these kids on campus, right?
Yes.
Compare your first 2000, 2009,
Yep.
2020.
Sure.
How much changed?
All right, so I'll restate the question so that those who are watching online can hear the question. So sort of frame in my own mind the differences between the 2000 students, the 2010 students, and today's students. I would say there's a couple different things. One is today's students come from a lot more brokenness than what students even a generation or a decade ago came from. There's a really frightening book that is incredibly good, but it's also really frightening. A book called The Coddling of the American Mind, written by a couple of guys. One, Greg Lukianoff, who is the head of a nonprofit organization that works with individual right kinds of legal claims, and the other, a professor at NYU's Stern Business School. And what they have documented through research is that right about 2014 or so, there were some dramatic changes that happened to the mindset of students. Here are a couple of examples. The rates of depression skyrocketed. Suicide attempts skyrocketed. Right about 2014, this is the most interesting one to me because it takes a little bit more digging, the markers of adulthood began to move further into life. So here's what I mean by that. For a long time, surveyors or researchers would ask questions of things like, when were you allowed to play alone for the first time? At what age? When were you allowed to sort of stay at home for the first time without a babysitter? When did you get your first job? And for years and decades, those answers were pretty solidly the same, right about the same time. I could play alone at age 8 and, stay at home by myself at age 12 and got my first job at age 13, something like that. Well, right around 2014, all of a sudden that all moves back. When did you play alone for the first time? Well, I think we were about 10. When did you get your first job? 18. So the markers of progression in adulthood got pushed back, And functionally, these authors argue, today's college freshmen, compared to a generation ago, have more of the life experiences in some ways of 15 to 16-year-olds than 18 to 19-year-olds. That has huge impacts for what we do on campus. Mental health, we could triple our mental health capacity on campus and it would get sucked up just like that. I think, quite honestly, and some of the research shows it, is these things have a lot to do with it. These things and the stuff that's on them, in particular social media. Social media has been remarkably wonderful in a lot of ways, and in my opinion at least, remarkably damaging in so many more. And we're seeing it in our kids, we're seeing it in our grandkids, and we're seeing it in our students. That's one way. Today's students also are much more diverse. Now, maybe that's not universally so at every institution, but we at Trinity, 20 years ago, we were, you might say, 75% Reformed kids, RCA, CRC, et cetera, and 25% other, which usually meant community church, maybe a Catholic or two there. Today, it's exactly flipped. We are 75% non-Reformed kids and probably more like 80 to 85% non-Reformed kids today. 2 years ago, we had more Catholic freshmen than CRC freshmen, and that trend only continues. Socioeconomically, we're much more diverse. Racially, we're much more diverse. We're pushing about 35 to 40% students of color on campus, and that number only continues to go up. It's a wonderful gift for us to be located in the spot we're in, because we're right in the heart of, frankly, a very incredibly diverse part of Chicago and a very incredibly diverse part of the world. So that's a change. The other thing I would say is students are, I don't mean this in a bad way, but they're a little more demanding. They're a little bit more used to things on demand, right? I can watch a movie whenever I want to watch it by pulling it up on my phone. I can check my bank statement wherever I'm located. I can get money whenever I want to. You know, I remember the days when you'd go pay with a credit card and they'd haul out that big machine and put the card in and chunk the thing, you know, all that kind of stuff. When you ran out of money, you were done because the bank wasn't open and there was no ATM. Today, students have everything on demand, so they expect highly responsive experiences in college as well. There's a lot of other ways students are different today, but those would be three that come to mind very much as well. I do also think that one of the things that we see at Trinity in particular is that students come to our college much less formed theologically and spiritually. If you've read some of the Christian Smith stuff from Notre Dame, and Todd Billings at Western Sem has talked a lot about this moralistic, therapeutic, deistic sort of thing. You know, God's out there and wants me to be happy and kind of winds the clock and lets it go and just be nice and be good, and that's good enough. I mean, that fits in with a lot of the students as they come to us as well. But one of the great gifts we have is an unbelievably strong theology department. So we actually graduate more theology major students than what said they wanted to be theology major students coming in, because for the first time, so many of our students, even those who go to Christian schools, frankly, experience what it means to really encounter the Christian faith in a meaningful and thoughtful way, in an environment where they can ask questions and learn deeply about the substance of what we say we believe and why we say we believe it. So it's an amazing experience for our students to have this. And I mean, hopefully, I'm not going to look at her right now, but our daughter who's here today, if you asked her who was her favorite professor during her 3.5 years at Trinity, she would very quickly say one of our theology profs. Deeply meaningful, deeply engaging, and for us, an incredibly great gift to have our students experience the Christian faith in that kind of way, in new and fresh ways that then changes their trajectory going forth. But they're not going to get it from the broader culture anymore. You know, they're swimming very much in dirty, churny waters, and the broader culture is not going to help them. So we've got to be very countercultural in that way. And that's changed a lot, even in the last 5 or 6 years.
What are the impacts of technology on your need of facilities?
Yeah, great question. One of the, so I bring a bit more of a, so I taught for 11 or so years at Hope part-time. I like ideas, I'm interested in ideas, I try to read a lot. But I do also bring a bit more of a non-traditional background to this role. And one of those is kind of a business background, risk management kind of thing. And, most institutions have sort of undertaken the idea of if there's not a shovel in the ground somewhere, something's wrong, right? What's the next building that's going to be built? Now, for a whole host of reasons, we've not really had a lot of that going on our campus. We had just finished up a building project when we got there, and we're in the middle of doing some remodeling work. But one of the things that we've really focused on at Trinity is how do we squeeze as much efficiency as we possibly can out of the spaces that we have. Before we put a shovel in the ground to put some new footings down to raise up another 3-story building or an addition, we want to make sure that we're squeezing everything we possibly can out of the existing space that we have. When our younger daughter was looking at colleges, and she applied to 16 different schools. Now, candidly, Mom and Dad had her apply to a few because we wanted to see how they did the recruiting piece, but she did lots of college visits as well. It's wonderful, wonderful intel that you can get from your children in this business to go out and see what they like and see how other schools do things. But one of the schools we went to is roughly the same size as we are, but probably has about a third more property than we have. Now, it's beautiful, great views, lovely green spaces, wonderful, wonderful things. But inside, I've been corrupted enough by this now. Inside, I'm thinking, wow, I wonder what they have to dedicate every year in resources to keep up all this property. Instead, what we want to do is think about how do we become really good stewards with the resources that we have, leveraging and maximizing as much space as we have. And so technology becomes a key piece of that. For us, for instance, we've had to repurpose some existing spaces to be used in ways that they had not intended to be used before. And also using them not just from, let's say, 9 to 3 in the afternoon, but finding ways to leverage them from 3 till 10 at night and on weekends as well. The last thing you want is a whole campus sitting dead at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That's a lot of wasted dormant resources sitting there. So yeah, technology matters deeply in all of this and has caused us to, frankly, become a whole lot smarter about space and a whole lot more cognizant about repurposing space than simply saying, well, we need this, so let's just build one of those.
Two-part question. To what extent are you engaged in meaningful conversations with some of the other college leaders, whether it's the Calvins and the Hopes and so forth, and how are you working together on some of these issues? Second question would be, challenge of finding the faculty you want to do the job you need to have done.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll take the first one first, and I'll touch on the second one as well. We have conversations, I would say, it's individualized in some ways. So we're part of associations that we typically get together. January is conference season, right? So wonderful conference that happens every year that we love to go to that we're not going to this year, obviously. And then mid-January, there's another conference in Washington, D.C., 2 conferences in Washington, D.C. to go spend time on the Hill that aren't happening this year either. So you get to know people near and far through those kinds of things. And frankly, there's something really enjoyable about the moral support that comes through that. Then I would say there's the more one-on-one kinds of conversations with like-minded, especially like-minded kinds of institutions. Michael Leroy at Calvin is a good friend, and Joe and Marty at Cornerstone, remarkably fantastic people. We have actually at Dordt College in Sioux Center, their president, Eric Hoekstra, is a Trinity alum, son of a former Trinity president, who's married to Barb Hoekstra, who is who is the Trinity alum, also married to, or also a daughter of a Trinity president. So, we have some good Trinity stock out in Sioux Center, doing good work there. And my alma mater at Northwestern, obviously, we connect well with them. And then we're connected, with Phil Reichen at Wheaton and others at, Trinity International in Chicago, more place-based kinds of things. This, I think, is the emerging question that will, if it were easy, it'd be solved by now. But I think the emerging question is, how do institutions like ours find ways to substantially enhance their financial positions? Some of that will come through philanthropy, but I do think some of this is going to have to come through mergers, acquisitions, and some cooperative partnerships. Again, as I think about what do I want to leave for my grandkids, I want them to have Trinity Christian College as an option. Absolutely, no questions asked. But I want them, even more than that, and I want that pretty much, even more than that, I want them to have the option of strong, faithful Christian colleges. And what is it going to take for us to do that? And there's a ton of inefficiency that operates at any institution. Surely, colleges are not immune to that. We're highly regulated, so we have to do lots of stuff based upon impositions by the state and federal government. All of that costs money. And if I liken our industry to banking, which I came from, there's been massive consolidation that's happened in the banking space, and we've not seen that kind of consolidation yet happening in the higher ed space. It wouldn't surprise me if we start to see it, necessity being the mother of invention. But there are historical examples, too. So Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania. Well, Franklin and Marshall is the merger of Franklin College and Marshall College back in, I think, 1865, something like that. So there are some examples historically as well. But I do think that because of the costs of doing this and the sort of fixed costs that come into play, we have to get some economies of scale built into the system. So this is a topic that everybody touches on and is, it's a little bit like Social Security for Congress, right? It's the third rail in some ways. You don't want it getting out there that, oh, you're talking about merging with somebody else, because that just causes some angst in the system. But fundamentally, I think you're going to start to see more of that happening. On the faculty side, how hard or how easy do we have in locating faculty that we want to hire? I would say in general, one of the lawyer's favorite answers is it depends. So some of the particular disciplines, we find really great candidates relatively easily. Other areas, we compete with industry, for example, pretty heavily. So we have a really robust nursing program at Trinity. It's I'll brag here for a second. It's, hopefully won't be struck down. It's the top-rated nursing program in the state of Illinois. And that includes, places like Northwestern and University of Illinois. So it's really, really good. Well, nursing faculty are in high demand because it's a growing and demanding field, and they can do really well in the practice itself. So some programs, some majors, we have more difficulty than others. I think one of the bigger challenges that we continue to have is we want to continue to diversify our faculty, but we want to do so in a way that reflects mission and is as a result of mission and is not seen as being sort of in competition with mission. So we as a Christian college, our mission statement is very long and very comprehensive. But what you will find in that statement is we explicitly say in that statement that we believe that God's kingdom and grace are wide and include all sorts of people from all sorts of different backgrounds, and no one person or place has a monopoly on what it means to be a child of God. So because of that, we seek to be a place that is more representative of God's greater world. We seek to be a place that is trying to get in on what God's doing in the world. And so therefore, we want our community to better reflect what God's doing in the world. So it's a subtle difference, but an important one, that we hire for mission first, and then we want all sorts of other things that come alongside of it. I would love to see I would love to be in a spot where I simply have so many incredibly great candidates across the board for every opening that it becomes, an embarrassment of riches. Lots of times we see that, but there are occasional moments where it's a little bit of a struggle, quite honestly. I think there was a question back here, too, at one point.
Something like great courses.
Yes.
Does that provide an opportunity to provide specialized education outside of your institution?
So great courses are really, there's a couple different things. So great courses is, some is like a podcast you can sort of log on to. There's also systems in colleges, we don't have it at ours right now, but a great books curriculum. Some institutions, North Central, for instance, in the Chicago suburbs, have an honors college that's a great books course. So basically a lot of their general ed stuff is related to pretty much a literature-type based system. It does present, I think, opportunities. And, if I had power to bring it back, but I won't, if we were looking at that slide that looked at top 5 things, what you noticed in the 2020 is it's really pragmatic, right? Here's the thing, though. The thing is that today's college students, the best research says, they're going to have anywhere from 5 to 15 different careers in their life, and probably higher to more like 15, not just jobs, careers. And many of those careers have yet to be invented. And if you talk to some of the leaders in a lot of the big technology places, they will say, yes, obviously it's a non-negotiable. We need engineers who can be engineers. We need computer people who understand computers. But we also need those people to be well-rounded individuals. That's their language, not mine. But people who can communicate well and think critically and be able to interact well with one another, the classic province, if you will, of the traditional liberal arts. So we think that combining the experience of being widely read, getting in on the big conversations that have been going on for centuries, is not at odds with particular kinds of training that allows students to move into a much more highly technical workforce today than what they did in the past. You can have both and that's an argument that takes some convincing, especially for younger students, but that's where having the right faculty makes all the difference in the world. I mean, again, I'll not pick on my daughter Juliana, but let's just say, so she was a health science and psych major. She wasn't, I mean, yes, she had to take some theology classes, but that probably was not sort of like, hey, I get to take some theology classes. Yes, this is what I get to do. It's more like, what do I have to do to, check that box and get through that requirement? And then she encounters Dr. Ben Ribbons. And first semester as a freshman, encounters Ben Ribbons, and then wants to take his class next semester because of the quality of the faculty member, opened her mind, opened her eyes, had her experience the Christian faith in remarkably, wonderfully new ways, and now is much better rounded and versed in lots of broader conversations because of those kinds of courses that we forced her to take, taught by incredibly good faculty. That's the sweet spot, I think, that we can find ourselves in.
Okay. Have you guys looked at artificial intelligence, computer learning? I've heard the military's used it for many years. It produces a better student than normal classrooms.
I don't know the research on that latter part. We use AI in, I would say, more administrative type roles, more administrative type ways. We're a pretty hands-on kind of place. And that's been one of the big challenges, quite frankly, in this COVID season, has been how do you keep the sort of interpersonal relationship and the mentorship that happens when you're sitting across a table enjoying a cup of coffee or sitting in a classroom and hang out a little bit afterwards for that great chance conversation that happens. How do you try and keep that going? And I'll tell you, it's hard. It's really hard to do. And can it be done? Yes. Are we getting better at it? Yes. Have we completely replaced the on-campus experience? Absolutely not. But one of the areas that we've been, frankly, as an institution, maybe a little slower on the uptick, and we're trying to make up ground fast, is on the computer science and data program side. So we, for instance, just launched a data program. We just launched a data program this fall that has some really stellar faculty associated with it. But just like you have to stand before you can walk before you can run, we're not quite at a spot yet where AI is going to take a major role in what we do.
But AI is like a one-to-one teacher-student teaching.
It is.
The computer knows how fast you're learning. He knows where you're weak. He comes back and goes over the weak parts back and forth. And as I said, it produces a better student than regular because it's one-on-one teaching. You can't afford one-on-one teaching.
I'll look into that a little bit more.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Always learning, right? Always learning. Thank you. Other questions? I don't know when we're supposed to adjourn here. About 5 minutes. Well, good. I've bored you silly. Oh, okay. I guess I haven't bored you silly enough yet. Okay. And I'm happy to talk about other stuff too. I mean, I'm not as well versed as what's been going on in Holland the last 5.5 years, but if you had any burning questions about, the former regime or anything, I'd be happy to talk with you about that as well.
I'm just wondering what you've been doing lately to put the brakes on this incredible increase in tuition and room and board every year. We've got grandkids that I think aren't going to be able to go to college because they won't be able to afford it. So what's in the works with that?
Yeah, so there's a variety of things that are happening there. So that slide I showed you where the numbers go up, that's the sticker price. And the reality is virtually nobody pays the sticker price. And this is the silly little thing about higher education. And if I could change it like that, I would do it like that. Let me give you 2 scenarios. Scenario 1 is tuition is $50,000 but I give your grandson a $25,000 academic scholarship. That's scenario one. Scenario two is sticker price is $25,000, and it's like, going to the store. The TV costs X amount, and that's what it costs. Study after study after study after study says people want the former for two reasons. One, they feel like they're getting a deal. And second, because they want to be able to tell their friends and neighbors that Johnny or Jill got, a $25,000 academic scholarship at Trinity, Calvin, Hope, you name it, University of Michigan. So that mindset is baked into the system so far. Was it, I don't think it was Thatcher who said it, but, something that can't continue forever won't. At what point won't it? There's a couple of signs we might be starting to reach the ceiling level on that. A couple of things. One, a variety of schools have done some pretty significant tuition resets. So they had been, priced their product at $47,000 to $55,000 a year and then discounted from there. There's been some significant movement. Carthage College in Kenosha did it last year. Central College in Pella, Iowa did it last year. Gordon College in Massachusetts just announced it. Seattle Pacific just announced it. And there's a few others that have done some similar kinds of things. What we frankly have discovered as we looked at Trinity, what we've looked at when we've looked at these other schools is, for the most part, their new tuition, their cut by a third, cut by a half tuition, is actually still higher than what ours is. So we've tried to sort of take an approach of saying, how do we engage with families in a fairly straightforward way? We still have to live in this world where people, want the scholarship experience. But how do we approach the relationship that we're building with families in a way that is built primarily upon integrity? Because imagine, nobody thinks about it this way, but if you're a school that says the sticker's $50 and we'll give you a $25,000 scholarship, essentially the relationship's built on a fraud at that particular moment, right? And we don't want to engage as little as we can in that kind of building of that sort of mindset. That's one way. So honesty in pricing and truly and realistic understanding of what do we need to do to provide the experience that our students expect. I could maybe not very easily, roughly easily design a college experience that costs $10,000 a year, like sticker, $10,000 a year. I don't think anybody would take it. Right? Because the interesting thing that I've seen so far, at least, is the folks who kind of want that $10,000 a year experience tend to be business people and tend not to be students looking at colleges. There's a great example. I won't say names, and I won't even give you much more detail than this, but an alum of ours who has been strong on this particular topic in significant ways. And rightly so. Calling higher ed to account. And wants to design a way for a $10,000 degree, and then his kid was a senior in high school, and his kid is now in college, and his kid, went to a school that cost significantly more than what ours did. So there's the theory, and then there's kind of that reality piece. So the one thing is sort of how do you manage cost? The second thing is we work a lot to create experiences so that students can get done faster. 4 years used to be kind of the typical time. In many state schools, 4 has turned into 4.5 to 5. We have none of our programs designed to last more than 4, and we can get you out in 3 if that's the case. A fair number of our students now come with significant amounts of college credit from their high schools. That helps cut things off, or cut off the time of completion and the cost of completion. So our older daughter here was done in 3.5 years. Just last week I was texting with our younger one. She's trying to think about how she gets done in 3.5 years. And so if you can winnow the time frame by a quarter, that's a pretty significant savings. And then the third piece is, how do we continually work to increase the financial aid available to students? Just last week I was on a Zoom coffee and cookie experience with, we call it the Trinity Oaks Society. It's our plan giving group, people who've left the college in their estate plans. A great time, fun time to hang out with these folks. They're just wonderful, wonderful people. Generally speaking, older, though not all of them. But through their estate plans, most of them are giving to scholarship funds as a way to help students supplement the costs. And honestly, there's higher ed is built on three legs. One is the cost of operation, right? So tuition, room, board, all those kinds of things. The other leg is kind of the annual gift that people will give to, fund a general fund kind of experience, kind of like what the church budget looks like. And then the third is long-term philanthropy, endowments, endowed scholarships, those sorts of things. In order for a college to really be stable and solid, you've got to have all three legs in place. And that third leg especially, when I talked earlier about what kind of places do we want to have existing for our grandkids, that third leg is the most significant place that all of us, whether we have large or small estates, can make a huge impact. Because Stanford's going to be just fine. Harvard's going to be just fine. They've got enough money in the bank that they're small countries, basically. Most institutions that require exclusively or nearly exclusively on tuition, room, and board to pay for faculty salaries, to pay to keep the lights on, as demographics change, that becomes harder and harder to get done. So yes, let me just make a final plug, if you will, for thinking about colleges of your choice in your estate plans. And if you don't have a college of choice, I've got one I can give you. So thank you all so very much. I've kept you 4 minutes late, but great to be with you. Thank you.
Just remember there you turned it back on. No class next Sunday, but then the next 2 weeks we have class. Thanks again, Kurt.